Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Brown. I am the director of the Defense Innovation Unit, and it's my job to welcome you all to this meeting of the Defense Innovation Board. So I thought I'd start with a little bit of orientation in case you're new to either the Defense Innovation Unit or the board. Where I spent most of my life in the private sector, you might think that this is the board for the Defense Innovation Unit, but things are a little more complex in government than that. So just orientation. Defense Innovation Unit is a group set up within the Defense Department working on projects, urgent projects from customers in the Defense Department. And we're looking for commercial solutions that can solve those problems within the Defense Department. The Defense Innovation Board is an independent advisory committee to give independent advice to the Secretary and the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, to which both the board and the unit report. So a little bit of orientation there. Last thing I want to do from a housekeeping perspective is let you know that there is a reception. It's sponsored by Vets in Tech. Thank you very much for that. That will be at noon, and it'll be in the room just opposite this auditorium. So we'll hope to spend a few minutes with you there afterwards. Now to start the meeting, Travis Sheets will get us going.
Hi, and good morning. Thank you to the Defense Innovation Unit for hosting us for today at the public meeting. My name is Travis Sheets, and I am your designated federal officer for the Defense Innovation Board. If you have not done so already, please take a second to silence your electronics. Today's meeting is being recorded and live streamed to allow members of the public to attend the virtual meeting. Thank you to the Defense Media Activity for providing their expert support to this event. Welcome to all of our in-person and virtual attendees. As we begin this meeting, allow me to share a few procedural remarks. This board is a discretionary independent advisory board operated under the Federal Advisory Committee Act and the Government in the Sunshine Act. Today's meeting was announced in the Federal Registry Notice posted July 11th, 2019. The public was invited to submit written comments for the board to consider. 13 comments were submitted and will be posted along with the public meeting minutes following this meeting. There have been no significant changes to the meeting's agenda as posted in the Federal Registry Notice. Depending on time constraints, there may be an opportunity for members of the public to provide verbal comments to the board today at the end of the meeting. As a reminder, these are comments to the board, not a question and answer session. With that, I say welcome. And I now turn the meeting over to the board's executive director, Josh Marcuse, for opening remarks.
Thanks so much, Travis, and thank all of you for coming today. I also want to thank our colleagues at Defense Innovation Unit, particularly Mike Brown, who've been incredible partners, not just for putting together conversations like this, but for the whole 3 years the board's been operating. It's great to be here. This is our third meeting we've held annually here in Mountain View, and it's very appropriate to have a Defense Innovation Board here in the seat of where so much of this technology development is happening, and a crucial role the DIU is playing in facilitating the access of the department to all of that innovation, and that's very exciting. So thank you very much for that. I want to first begin by introducing our board members to those on the live stream and also here in the room. Of course, we have Dr. Eric Schmidt, our chair, technical advisor at Alphabet and a former CEO of Google and former chairman of Alphabet. We have Mr. Kurt Del Bene, the chief digital officer of Microsoft, as well as Dr. Michael McQuaid, vice president of research at Carnegie Mellon University, Mr. Milo Medin, the vice president of wireless services at Google, Dr. Richard Murray, the professor of control and dynamical systems and bioengineering at Caltech, Ms. Jen Palka, the founder and executive director of Code for America and former deputy chief technology officer of the United States, Dr. Daniela Roos, the director of the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, CSAIL, at MIT, Dr. Mark Sarangelo, scholar in residence at the University of Colorado and a former executive vice president of Sierra Nevada Corporation, Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, director of the Hayden Planetarium. And then on the phone, we have Dr. Missy Cummings, who, in addition to being one of the first female fighter pilots in the Navy, currently runs the Humans and Autonomy Lab at Duke University, as well as Marnie Levine on the line, who is the Vice President of Global Partnerships and Business Development at Facebook. So let me quickly review what the agenda we have in store for you today is. We'll begin by getting updates from our two subcommittees. We'll start with the Workforce Behavior and Culture Subcommittee that's co-chaired by Jen Palka, and then we'll work through the Science and Technology Subcommittee. Milo will give a couple sort of overview remarks to shape the work that we're doing with that, and then we'll have presentations to the subcommittee. We're very excited. We're joined today by Dr. Michael Zatman, who is the Assistant Director for Networked C3, which is Command, Control, and Communication in the Research and Engineering Organization. So he'll be giving a presentation to the board about the work he does there. Then we'll move on to a conversation about zero trust, a cybersecurity conversation, although it is really broader than cybersecurity. And Kurt will lead up that discussion, and we hope to actually have a vote on the white paper. The white paper is posted on our website. And then Michael McQuaid will talk about our ongoing work we've done for the last almost year, because that project kicked off in this room last July, almost exactly 1 year ago today. So he'll give an update on our work on AI principles and ethical norms for AI and warfare. And at that point, I'll sort of conclude the two subcommittee presentations, and then I'll give a quick briefing, as we do at every meeting, to let the board members know what the Department of Defense is doing with the advice and recommendations they've received over the last several years. So it's really a chance to highlight, I think, some of the promising developments all across the department and the services and elsewhere, things that are people doing remarkable things to promote technology and innovation in the department. And then we get to hear from you, which is always something that the board members will look forward to. So I'll have the microphones going around, and you'll have a chance to make a comment. Comments need to be limited to 2 minutes. And if you wouldn't mind filling out a form just so we know who you are, it's important that we collect that for our records. And then they'll end the conversation. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Eric, our chair, to get things started.
So, thanks, Josh. It's great to be back. We had a very, very good year, in my humble opinion. We did an awful lot of work to help the creation of something called the Joint AI Center, which is something we had talked about a few years ago and discussed when we were here last year. We delivered something which we call the SWAP study, which is a very, very broadly reviewed and held set of principles for the military, for the government around how to use software. Many people have said it's the best software report that's ever been written, or at least in the context of the military. And of course, we released a 5G report that's had a great deal of impact and discussion. So what we do is, this is now, I think, our third or fourth year in the cycle. Is we sort of sit down and we say, what are the interesting projects that we think we're going to work on in the next year? Because we're a FACA committee, we want to make sure that we're communicating as we think about these things. Maybe we'll do these, maybe we won't, but this is the sort of current thought list. We've got a large number of AI and ML projects. I think everybody here, especially, I don't need to tell Silicon Valley this, that AI and machine learning is taking over the world. It's transforming the Bay Area. It's certainly going to transform all the other communities that we work with. You're going to hear a lot about Network C3. It's taken me a while to get used to the acronyms, but C3 is important. We've been interested in biotech for quite some time, both in terms of a threat issue to the nation, as well as what does the technology allow, and so forth. And again, we have some projects that we're going to discuss in that. The general issue about security and networks and how do people work together in a world where people don't fully trust each other has resulted in a couple of projects. One is involved in zero trust. You're going to hear about that. And another one has to do, but that ultimately gets expressed as software. And then zero trust microelectronics. Literally, what do you do about the microelectronics supply chains and so forth? And we have interesting ideas there. And then there's a lot of concern that from a national perspective, we make sure that the innovation that the country needs is well-funded, well-structured, and in the United States or in our allies. We want to make sure that we have all the necessary components to provide fantastic technology leadership under the control of our great nation. So those roughly 7 areas appear to be the sort of the next 12 months of priorities. And of course that can change based on what comes up in the outside and then whatever else the folks in the DoD are interested in. We continue to be obsessed with the fact that the military is full of very, very good people, and that many of those good people are not treated correctly, their skills are not recognized, they're not promoted, It's just a whole bunch of issues. This is so important that in a second, Jen's going to talk about the workplace and culture program, which frankly goes hand in hand. For those of you that are in the venture industry here, you understand that what venture is, it's basically all about talent. So why is that not also true in the DoD? It makes perfect sense. So, and we have not put enough, in my humble view, again, and we've not put enough effort in that in our own activities, and I can assure you the DoD has not, relative to the importance. And I think that's why we want Jen to talk about this in just a sec. So we're always interested in your ideas. We want to do this as openly and transparently as a process. It's important. There's a great deal of money involved. There's an awful lot of important issues being handled. Lots of people need to participate in this conversation. So with that, maybe I could just directly go to you, Jen. And why don't you, since you haven't really talked about this formally, maybe you could start by saying, why did you set this up? What are the problems? And how are you going to fix them? Aside from that, here you are.
Okay, that's a big, big ask, but I will set it up. Thank you. And I think it's very important that we talk about this today. Perfect transition. I think that has been the experience of all of us, especially for me, sort of getting to know the military over the past couple of years after joining the Defense Innovation Board, is meeting so many, as you say, very, very good and bright and wonderful people who want to serve their country and want to serve their country in the way that it needs serving today. That it's a little bit different than it has been in the past. And I think today I'm going to talk about how we have seen all these bright spots and we're very excited about them, but there are some threats to the continuation of those bright spots growing, and that is talent. So on behalf of also Adam Grant, who is on the board but not here with us today, who is chairing that committee, and then the wonderful staff of the DIB on this particular subcommittee, Ben Bain and Aaron Bugg and others. I will give a little bit of an overview of what we're thinking and then ask for your help. So yes, we've been going around to places like Kessel Run and the Joint AI Center, and there we're seeing that the Defense Department is doing, in many ways, what needs to be done to defend our country in a digital age. These are places with fantastic, talented developers and others there using their skills to modernize our ability to defend our country. And what's happening that's been sobering for us is that so many of the people who either are working there in those places or are qualified to work there and want to work there are either not able to join or are being rotated out. And we think that that's, if you were, as Eric said, if you were running a startup here in Silicon Valley and all of your talent were rotated out routinely, you would not succeed. There are larger fixes to this, and we have talked about that in our other papers, in the recommendations that you can see on the Defense Innovation Board website, and I think they're very important, including the fact that we need a career track for technical people in the Department of Defense. We've talked about this before. You can be a lawyer in the military, you can be a doctor in the military and actually do your specialty. You can't do that as a software developer right now. And it's important that, we believe it's very important that the Defense Department stay on track and create this career track so that folks don't have to constantly rotate out. But that kind of fix is probably, I'm told, about 5 years. It's going to take a while to make the large reforms that are required to fix this permanently. And in the meantime, we see a crisis where you have people with the initiative and they're not able to get in or stay in. And so we are proposing with this Workforce Now initiative to propose some significant short-term fixes, because I don't believe that we can afford the continued impact of these folks not being able to be placed in these specialty jobs in technology for 5 more years. I think the impact of 5 more years of this would be more than the department should be willing to bear. So let me just give some examples. What do I mean when I'm talking about this? You've got, say, a young officer who graduates from a military academy and goes to a top university and gets a degree in machine learning. shouldn't the department be able to recognize the specialty skills that young person has and put them in a job that's going to take advantage of that? That is currently not the case. We have places like Kessel Run and the Joint AI Center where the individuals trying to staff those units have identified talented individuals, tried to bring them in. Those folks want to come in, but what we understand is it's multiple 2, 3, and 4-star generals, not just one, multiple, all need to weigh in and okay a move like this every single time. Imagine that across the number of people that are needed to staff something like the Jake and something like Kessel Run and all of the other units that are coming up and need to come up to give the department the capacity that it's going to need in these important areas, as Eric was talking about. Unfortunately, the human capital systems that the Department of Defense run, which should be enabling the placement of these people with these skills where they are needed, is actually keeping them apart right now instead of putting them where they need to be. It's in many ways a system that deserves a lot of respect. It's developed over many decades, but it was developed for a different era and with different needs. The basic fundamental principle of the system, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here and you all know this, but for those of us in Silicon Valley who are learning this, the basic fundamental principle of this system is that every individual is interchangeable at any rank or any level. And while that can be very helpful in certain circumstances, in this particular circumstance where we need people with technical skills and we need them very critically, that is not working in our favor. What do we hope to accomplish with this Workforce Now initiative, which is, again, about many shorter-term fixes while we push for and wait for the longer-term fix of career paths and others? We want to continue to interview and do feedback sessions with the goal of having clear, actionable recommendations for the board to consider and vote at our next public meeting in October. And we would like your help so that when we come back next time, we are closer to that set of clear, actionable recommendations. Particularly, there are people that we need to talk to outside of just the circles that we know, and we're hoping that some of you can offer connections to us for people that we haven't met yet, particularly leaders with open requirements and billets for digital skills, for instance, machine learning, software development, AI. We're looking to talk to service members with skills and experience in digital technology who are struggling to apply them within their existing career field. As I've said, we've met many of these people. We'd like to meet more of them and understand what's going on for them. And I should note that one of the things that we know is a significant issue here is that for those folks to take a sidestep into, say, a Jake or a Kessel Run or another unit like this, poses significant career risk to them right now. I see many heads nodding out there. It's not, as Eric said, we don't think it's right to be creating so much career risk for them. This is not in their interest necessarily to do these things. And frankly, we see many of them willing to do it, the majority of them willing to do it despite the career risk. But we'd like to understand that more and be able to incorporate that into our next set of recommendations. We'd like to talk to decision makers within the department responsible for assigning active duty service members to better understand the pressures and incentives of their job. We know there are people saying, nope, we need that person on this aircraft carrier doing this other task, even though we believe others could do it. We want to understand why there is sometimes a resistance to moving a person with specialized digital skills into a digital unit, and really understand that view of it. And we'd like to talk to senior leaders who are hungry for change in this space and willing to test prototype solutions alongside us. Of course, we're always looking for ideas on providing incentives to the service's personnel assignment offices focused on the value of sending such officers to these critical and impactful opportunities. So I know there'll be time in the comments and afterwards for you to share those ideas with us, and we hope that you have many of them because we could really use them. Thank you.
My guess is that this human, the human resource problem is probably even harder than the technical problems we have addressed, based on how difficult it has been to get people's attention. And frankly, I will tell you, the reports we've seen are insane. You take these incredibly talented people, and then you run them through the mill, right? And at some point they say, look, this is not what I want to do. I want to do something, that I trained for.
Yeah. I would call it sometimes really heartbreaking to see people who really want to serve and really have those skills and not being able to have them there. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that there are many bright spots in the department where folks are trying to solve this problem. It's not just us, and that's always true. In particular, like to call out the Air Force intelligence community, which has been rewriting its talent management framework. And they have a great line, which is really exactly what we're trying to say here. There's no single pathway to career success. There's got to be other ways that you can grow and succeed, especially through a technical track. We've got to, at least in enough areas to create the space for the people that we want, we've got to have not just that forcing you down that very, very, very narrow path, because it's going to drive, it is currently driving great talent away from the department just when we need it most.
So thank you for that, and obviously this is going to become a huge focus this year. So Milo, do you want to give us an update of the Science and Technology Subcommittee? You I think, and Richard and Michael, a bunch of you, yeah. It's at least the three of you to my right. Go ahead. And Kurt, you joined as well. Okay, and Kurt, you're going to do the zero trust stuff later, right? Okay, Milo.
Thank you, Eric. So the S&T committee's been busy on a number of topics. Kurt will talk about our work on zero trust in a few minutes. We've also been working on battle networks and the architecture and sort of assumptions that are going into the command and control systems that enable commanders and operators to have the best information about the employment of weapon systems and use of force. It's interesting, 30 years ago I worked across the street at NASA Ames. At that time the government had all the high-end R&D in communications and computing was really being done in the government. Today that's now being led in the commercial sector. And so part of what we're trying to look at is what are lessons and capabilities that the commercial sector has developed that could be useful in the DoD context for battle networks. This is not just about raw bandwidth, though that's part of it. It's not okay that a carrier battle group has less communications bandwidth available to it than a cruise ship, which is true. But it's also about how we think about security in networks, right? Bespoke systems that focus on communication security rather than information security make it difficult to interoperate and share context. How do you get resources allocated to the users who need that bandwidth the most when it's required? So part of what our work in this space is focused on, we're going to have a battle network day tomorrow. It'll be closed, but we're working on recommendations in this space. The S&T committee's also always been very focused on AI and ML, as Eric said. We're very pleased to be working with the JAIC and an effort with the Joint Pathology Center. The Joint Pathology Center, for those of you who don't know, houses one of the world's largest collections of human tissue samples, approximately 55 million slides. This is an initiative led by Dr. Eric Lander, who's on the DIB, and supporting Dr. Alexander Titus, who's the Assistant Director for Biotechnology for the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. It's an exciting project to digitize the sample repository. It advances disease detection and diagnostics and offers the potential to save the department significant healthcare costs. DIU is doing great work in this space, especially Dr. Ryan Capital and Dr. Matt Goldman. We're excited to continue partnering with the DIU in this important area. So now I'm going to turn it over to Josh.
Great. Thank you, Milo. So I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Zatman. We're honored to have him join us and provide some remarks to the board about his work. Just a brief introduction and framing. His responsibility covers the design of the kinds of networks that Milo described with the purpose of maximizing data transfer speed and throughput for the diverse set of endpoints that all the different services in OSD and intelligence community systems use in order to minimize the latency of those systems and also to improve their resiliency all the way to the tactical edge where our customers, our warfighters, need them most. He's working closely with us on these efforts, but really working all across the DoD enterprise to try to bring all these disparate systems and choices in together to a harmonized approach that will help our service members get access to the information they need at the right time and speed. So, Dr. Zatman, over to you.
Thank you, Josh. I'm going to start off by just explaining what is an assistant director, and that'll help at least those of people who are intimately familiar with the way that the DoD is set up at the moment, what our role is. I then explain what my role is as Assistant Director for Fully Network Command, Control and Communications, and then give a brief overview of the areas that we're working on in order to try and improve the interoperability, flexibility, and resilience of the DoD Command, Control, Communication systems. So first of all, what is an Assistant Director? To explain that, I need to explain how the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering is organized. It's really organized as a matrix organization. The vertical columns of that organization are the different funding lines. Those different funding lines, they're led in part by Dr. Nikolic, who runs the Research and Technology, which is kind of 6.1 and 6.2 funding lines, which is basic and applied research. And then Mr. Feist, who runs the 6.3 and 6.4 funding lines, which is advanced development and demonstration and validation. In addition to those funding lines, there's several field offices, such as the DIU, DARPA, Strategic Capabilities Office, Missile Defense Agency, Space Development Agency, and so on, which also all report up to the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, which is Dr. Griffin and his deputy, Lisa Porter. So the vertical part of the matrix are those funding lines. The horizontal rows of the matrix are the assistant directors. And there's 10 of us. We're assistant directors of research and engineering. They exist for hypersonics, fully network command, control, and communications, autonomy, space, AI and machine learning, quantum, cyber, biotechnology, microelectronics, and directed energy. Our role is to really look across the entire research and development portfolio, all of those funding lines I mentioned before, and through into the services, and to manage the portfolio in our technical areas across those services. So that includes managing synergy amongst the funding lines, and also managing how different technologies mature through the system, starting off in basic research, moving to applied, advanced development, and demo and validation, maybe through a JCTD or something. So those are the roles of the assistant directors. Fully network command, control, and communications. Of all of the assistant directors, this seems to be the strangest title. I have an adverb and a verb acting as an adjective to describe the rest of it. Fully network being the adjective for command, control, and communications, which is the noun. There's really two things that this compromises. Command and control, and that's really a function. And then the infrastructure is the communications and networking are really the infrastructure on which command and control and a whole bunch of other military functions reside. So the fully networked adjective is really part of one of our objectives in this area. Basically, that everything should be a node on the DoD network. There's also some other objectives, that we should make our systems more flexible, interoperable, and diverse. And by making them more flexible and interoperable and diverse, we enable our warfighters to do more and to do it in a more reliable and robust fashion. And also, we're going to continue to develop better equipment, better waveforms, and better techniques. Why are we working so closely with the Defense Innovation Unit and the Defense Innovation Board? Going back 20, 30 years, the military led the world in the investment in communications. And our military systems were the best out there. We put the seed into the communications industry that now the communications industry has grown with all of cellular and SATCOM and everything else that's out there. The investment in research and development for commercial communications far outweighs that goes into military communications. So now the role is reversed. We're working with the DIB and the Defense Innovation Unit to see how can we leverage the investment that the commercial world is making in order to take advantage of it for our military needs. So within my strategy, there's 4 thrusts. The first one is unified or universal command and control. Then there's networking, something I'll call physical layer convergence that I'll describe a bit later. And lastly, infrastructure. That infrastructure is basically taking the first 3 technologies and putting them into systems. Universal command and control is really all about interfaces. At the moment, every single DoD system and subsystem seems to have its own interface control document. And trying to integrate new capabilities together means people are working with half a dozen different interface control documents. Everybody's interpreting those in a different way and somehow trying to make a system and integrate it together. That takes time, and if that takes time, that means we lose flexibility and then capability. So what we're studying is how much does it make sense to have a more universal interface control document for what we're trying to do in the military for command and control. And if it makes sense, we will then go ahead and start to implement something along those lines. Why do I question if it makes sense? One example that people use in terms of coming up with standards is the desktop personal computer market, starting in the 1980s and moving through to the 1990s. What started off as something that was very particular, quickly developed standards, and then you could interchange your monitor, your graphics driver, your graphics card, your memory, your disk drives and everything, and you could configure a desktop computer to be a particular configuration that was optimized for what you needed. All of these standards enable the flexibility. And that served us very well in the desktop computer market. But there are times when the overhead that incurred proved to be a disadvantage. An example now being our handheld computing devices, our smartphones. Our smartphones no longer have interchangeable graphics cards, interchangeable disk drives and memory, and so on. And that's because the overhead of having everything interchangeable with all of those standards cost size, weight, and power. And size, weight, and power are all very critical issues when you're looking at a handheld mobile device. In command and control, trying to go to universal ICD, there's also an overhead that we might incur. That overhead can be measured not in size, weight, and power, but in terms of latency of the system, in terms of how much communications bandwidth do I need in order to get the information across, and how much computation do I need in order to do that. So at the moment, we're studying those issues to see what makes sense going ahead. What are the issues, like the smartphone, where that overhead is going to cost us too much? Moving on to networking. We're trying to make our networks more diverse and therefore make them more robust and also make them more flexible. In terms of diversity, we can use a smartphone again as an analogy. At the moment, you can imagine we have a lot of military networks where it's one radio that's talking to another radio. If you look at what we do with our cell phones probably have 6 different bands on them, 2 Wi-Fi bands, 4 cellular bands. And that redundancy and that diversity is used to make sure that we have reliable connectivity to the internet, either through our Wi-Fi infrastructure or through the cellular infrastructure. We need to try and get the same type of diversity into our military networks. Now, the next question is, how do you manage that diversity? And there's something else in the commercial world that we can start taking advantage of. Software-defined networking and the use of virtualization and network slices is something that we can use in order that we can give our different user groups the kind of quality of service that they need. Those accesses and those quality of service change between different user groups, just like they do for the different use cases in network slicing that we're seeing on the various commercial networks and in 5G. Physical layer convergence is really all about multifunction devices. One way to think about it is the same radio I use to do navigation, the same radio I use to do communication, it can also receive navigation signals. I could also use it maybe to do some kind of radar mission, and it's interchangeable, it's a multifunction device. We use physical layer convergence as a term because this also applies in the optical and the acoustic domains. One of the reasons we're interested in this is because it allows you to make better use of the resources, those resources being power, aperture, and bandwidth. These resources are becoming ever more scarce, bandwidth in particular, as there's increasing needs for it, but also in terms of trying to find space for aperture, for radio systems, and the power that they need. If we can make better use of those resources, we can do more with what we have. The last piece then, we have those three technology areas, is the infrastructure that pulls those all together, that pulls together all of those different technologies into a set of systems that the military can use to ensure that we have robust, reliable communications and networking that enables us to do our command and control as necessary. Are there any questions or?
We have plenty of time for questions.
Can I? Sure. So that was a great overview. Why do you think DoD systems are so fragmented? Nobody made a decision, right? Let's keep all our stuff fragmented and non-interoperable.
So one of the reasons they're fragmented is because the DoD itself is fragmented. Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines. The acquisition budgets and a lot of the research and development budgets sit with those individual services. The services, until recently, have had no need to synchronize their investments. So what we've seen happen is different services make different investments at different times, and that means when they try and operate jointly, they have disparate capabilities. And it's not really a matter of the services not wanting to do anything, they've just let the timeline slip, so they're no longer synchronized with each other, so that we don't get a synchronized joint capability.
Just to hammer on this, we always hear that this service won't work with that service, but I'd be happy if one service worked with itself, and that if if every service had a fantastic C3 architecture that just worked seamlessly and perfectly and great, that would really, really help them. So just talking about the service itself, pick any one you wish, that you understand them all. What's the gap between where they are and how a service could get itself in good shape?
So how do I do that without insulting any service?
You could insult them all uniformly.
I mean, in the same way that the services are stovepipes from each other, there are stovepipes within the services themselves. So, an example might be the Navy. The individual ship classes turn out to be individual stovepipes within the Navy. And that those ship classes have their own systems that are unique to those ships. And as somebody goes, in the past, as they've gone and developed the next frigate, they've not worried about how is that going to be compatible with the cruiser. As they've developed the next carrier, they've not worried how that's going to be compatible with the destroyers that are protecting it. Not just within, I don't have to pick on all military services equally. And the Air Force has disparate needs between the tankers, the ISR part, and the fighters and the bombers. And there's different cultures amongst those organizations. And the culture at the top of the Air Force is you had to be a fighter pilot. I think that's well known. The Army also has big differences between the biggest section is the group on land, but Army aviation has more aircraft than the Air Force. And so again, you have those separate, you then have those separate stovepipes. And to add another stovepipe in there, the different commands actually have their own issues. So for example, Strategic Command, which runs which amongst other things runs all of our nuclear capabilities, has its own unique requirements and thinks about things in its own stovepipe. So the fact that there have been stovepipes within the services has been an issue. One of the things that R&E is working on in order to get over this is something called communities of interest. So there are communities of interest in biotech, in C4, in microelectronics and other things that go across the whole department and across all of the services. Those communities of interest are working at the engineer level, the researcher level, amongst all of the DoD labs in order to get commonality at that level. And it's a kind of a bottoms-up effort in order to help commonality happen. One thing that we've seen recently that I'd like to at least show as being a good thing is that we've started to see these communities of interest propose projects themselves, and those have come up. And for example, one was recently funded within one of the funding lines called the Rapid Prototyping Fund. The services all had their own special projects, but one of the ones that got funded actually came up through a community of interest. So we are doing things to try and overcome some of those issues.
Maybe two things. So first of all, you said something which is very important and aligns pretty strongly with what's been a mantra of the Defense Innovation Board for a long time. So recognizing and honoring history of what started in the Department of Defense and became commercial, we're now at a place where the first place we need to look for capacity and capability is in the commercial sector, where there are reasons and investment reasons and infrastructure reasons that place the technology landscape in a superior position in many cases. And so recognizing that as you roll out into the job, I think that's a really important thing to do without ignoring where things are highly specific to the department. So good for that. I think that resonates with where we have constantly come down. The second comment is more of a question for you, which is, as I look through the portfolio the way you've described it, maybe I'm asking for a sort of philosophical question of how much of at the end of the day do you get to which is about software-defined capability versus where does your portfolio have to overlap with the microelectronics portfolio, secure supply, et cetera. So can you just make a few comments on how that sits in your life?
Sure. So, at least, all three technology areas that I've talked about are essentially software-defined issues. The universal command and control is all about software and functional interfaces, and the networking is essentially a software-defined issue about how you use the hardware. The physical layer convergence, again, is I have some hardware. What's the software that allows me to do multiple things with it? That doesn't say that we're not looking at the hardware. We've been very good within a DoD at producing exquisite hardware. And we're starting to become good at saying how can we use commercial hardware more effectively for the DoD. Your issue about security, supply chain, microelectronics, all relates into how we work with each other. There's 10 assistant directors. One of the other ones is the assistant director for microelectronics, who's Nicole Petter. The 10 of us sit in the same office suite. There's lots of overlap between us. And so, I've certainly put lots of microelectronic issues within the communications world go back and forth between myself and Nicole. Issues to do with cybersecurity go back and forth between myself and the assistant director for cyber. Issues to do with SATCOM, both myself and the assistant director for space work across those. So there's a coordination between us that covers the overlap. The fact that we have all of these 10 portfolio managers trying to work on the strategies for these portfolios together in an environment where we're not stovepipe from each other allows us to do that effectively.
Thank you.
In addition to stovepiping, I wonder if you might give us a sense of how mobility plays a role in how you think about mobility, movement, because all the networks you have to deal with are involve assets that move.
So it's interesting that you bring that up, and especially because Michael, just before you, brought up the issue about there are differences between mobile and commercial networks. So the way I like to think of what we're doing is you can think of the networking, you can think of it on two axes. You can think of the first axis as being how mobile are you, or how variable is your environment. The second axis is how heterogeneous or homogeneous are your links. In a commercial world, you try and have very static, you try and place yourself in a very static situation. You know, most of the links, except when you get to the end user device, are static, they're not mobile. It's only the end user device, you to the Wi-Fi router or you to the cell tower, that's mobile. And that you have a very homogeneous set of links. In the military, you know, we don't have that same predictability. We have unpredictable links due to all of the mobility that you brought up, and we have a very heterogeneous set of radios. As heterogeneous as you have in your end user device, but not necessarily coordinated as well as they should be. And so exactly what you bring up are some of the issues that Michael referred to before as a difference between commercial and military, and we have to think very carefully, along with the DIU and DIB, about how we can take the commercial technology and apply it in that different environment.
I guess my question is, do you foresee a more integrated set of C3 networks? And how will it actually happen? Like, you use the example of the frigates and the aircraft carriers. And what happens, of course, is those contracts were let 10 years ago. The contracts include well-categorized, certified solutions, which are stovepiped. So it's an enormous amount of work to make that change. What is a realistic expectation that we can collectively work for?
So the answer to your first question is yes. The second is, how do we get there? And you know, at least within research and engineering, we're all about taking a long-term view of how we get from A to B. The whole point of the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering is not what are we trying to do next year or even 18 months from now, what are we trying to do, where do we want to be 5 or 10 years now so we can make those investments, do those demonstrations so that that capability can be fielded. So you know, we're not going to turn things overnight from being completely stovepiped and difficult to talk to each other to being able to be fully networked and everybody be unified and being able to talk to who they need to talk to. At the security level, they need to talk to each other with the quality of service that they need. So we're taking a long-term view. In each of the technology areas that I discussed, we're making investments, whether it's at the basic, applied, or higher level demonstration research levels over the next 5 years in order to get those technologies to be where they are so that we've taken the risk off the table and the acquisition side of the house can then purchase those. That says that we'll have new systems that are capable of being as networked and as unified as we want. We still have to work with the vast amount of legacy systems that are out there. You know, something that surprises me is that we have ships that were commissioned in the 1980s that are due to be refitted soon, but still have 1970s computing technology on them. So as we work about the new technology, we also have to work about how do we form a bridge to the legacy systems and what technologies do we need to have in terms of translators, in terms of things that can multiplex both legacy and current networks and future networks at the same time in order to carry those over.
Perhaps they could upgrade the PCs from the 1970s to the 1980s model?
One other thing I think it's probably important to talk about is if you move to cloud-based backends, right, for services, the networks become even more important, right? Not just the bandwidth, but also security in that context. How do you think about cloud and the future of DoD C3?
So that's a double-edged sword because, you know, for the cloud to work, you need to have a very good network. But as we move to software-defined networks, it's the cloud that's organizing the fact that it's software-defined. So one of the issues that we have to tackle from a technical point of view is as we move from that network, the commercial network I described before, where we've developed these technologies, which is static and fairly homogeneous in its links, to something which is variable and inhomogeneous, how do we re-architect the cloud to be robust under those circumstances? So, you know, I certainly think the cloud is the right way to go for the moment. And if you go back to the 1970s, we sort of had the cloud and everybody had a little terminal.
Yes, right.
We then moved into the 80s and the 90s, and we had, everybody had all of the capability on their computer. And now we've kind of gone back to having centralized capability again. I'm curious to see what will happen 20 years from now. But, for a moment, given where we are, I think the cloud is the right way to go. How we migrate the cloud to being robust on a tactical network with its variability and with its inhomogeneity of the links is something that is a problem that we are looking to tackle. Thank you.
I think next we'll move on to the Zero Trust paper. So, Kurt, if you're ready, take it away.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I'm going to speak a bit about the Zero Trust networking paper that we put together. I'll give a little bit about the background of why we were asked to pull this together and why we thought it would be important, talk about our approach a little bit, and then for those not familiar with Zero Trust as kind of the future networking concept, go over it briefly. I'm not going to go through everything that Zero Trust is all about. We will publish the paper after these deliberations, but want to give you some sense of it. This came about as a result of the work that we've been doing on the SWAP report as well as the Better Networks effort. When we talked to a bunch of people and realized this idea of Zero Trust is catching on within the DoD, perhaps not everywhere it needs to, but that it's a real strong effort within industry that needs to be pulled into the DoD, into the armed services, and really embraced. So we thought it would be helpful to write a report or a paper that really would allow all DoD members and leaders and people that are involved with computing systems and networks in the DoD to understand the concepts of Zero Trust and also ask the right questions of people that they come in contact with of, are you actually embracing Zero Trust as a concept? What would be the primer and what would be the set of key questions to ask to really see if you're on the right track there? So we actually settled upon two different parts of the report. There's an unclassified part, which we can distribute. We're also working on a classified part, which goes more into the details of what's going on within the DoD, the efforts, the pilots that are going on, and views of that and next steps that will go on from there. The paper covers the following set of areas. It goes through the imperative for a Zero Trust architecture overall for our networking in order to secure it against future cyber threats, the current state of the problem that we're solving for Zero Trust as the future. What does that look like? Steps towards getting to Zero Trust. It is not something that actually monolithically needs to be deployed. It can actually, contrary to some people's points of view, can be deployed over a period of time and positive steps and benefits realized along the way. Why the DoD is ready to implement this and some of the pilots that are going on. Questions for people to ask, as I said. If you are interested and if we think Zero Trust is important, what do you want to ask to see if it's actually being embraced in your organization? And then finally, we list a set of resources for people to look to learn more about what Zero Trust is all about. I'd first like to thank the people who worked on this study with me. There were really 4 primary contributors. I was one of those. I lead our internal systems development in Microsoft, our internal systems that we depend upon. As part of my responsibility, I've been in the industry for 2 decades and really seen how our approach to networking has evolved over time. We also have systems that are as much as 20 years old, and we have to think through how we're going to evolve our internal networking. And the notion of Zero Trust is a core part of where we're moving in terms of our internal networking. Richard Murray, Richard is the Thomas E. and Doris Everhart Professor of Control and Dynamic Systems and Bioengineering at Caltech. In that sense, he works on the application of feedback and control to network systems in general, and worked on the SWAP study. So Richard's in a great position to kind of reflect on the learnings there and what we learned in terms of Zero Trust networks. Milo Medin is the VP of Wireless Services at Google and previous leadership positions, technology networking companies and NASA, as you heard. And Google has been a pioneer with their effort called Beyond Corp and moving to Zero Trust. So he was a key contributor to our efforts as well. And then Gilman Louie, who you see in the audience, who acted as a consultant to the DIB and has been involved with the DoD and government systems for many years and had a lot of contributions to make the report as well. We also received input from folks in DDS, the Defense Digital Service, from DISA Cybercom, and others in the DoD, really to kind of better understand what the current point of view is and where they are in their efforts internally. So with that, let me turn briefly to the paper overall. And the thing I think that is most important to understand is that cyber threats are increasing in sophistication and in intensity over time. We just in Microsoft are seeing literally a tenfold increase in the attacks that we see and that we see in the industry overall. And the notion of how cyber attacks occur is getting more and more sophisticated. So things like social engineering of interactions with individuals to get them to give away their credentials are becoming commonplace. And what you find as a result of that with this rapid evolution is that the traditional notion of perimeter-based security is no longer sufficient. Just very, very quickly, the whole notion of perimeter is you have a network, you're not allowed in unless you provide name and password. But typically when you get in, you have rights to almost everything. And with this increase in sophistication, it is inadequate to say that that is the boundary of our domain or our security domain. So zero trust has emerged as a way to kind of approach that by augmenting perimeter security. It does not replace perimeter security, it adds to it. To level set on what it is, in the simplest terms, it means that there is no trust within the network. You assume that the network is going to be breached, and it doesn't actually give you rights to anything once you're inside the network. And so there's a whole set of efforts that you have to do that assumes the breach occurs, but then all the security comes from your particular credentials of who you are as a result. You have to think about with the increasing number of endpoints within a network, if you think about new technologies like AI and 5G and more endpoints, the intensity of network usage is going to increase. The points of potential risk are going to increase as well. And so again, this notion of assuming that you're going to be breached and figuring out a different approach to how you're going to secure yourself becomes more and more important. It also means that left to its own devices, because of this increase in complexity, your cost of managing your network, of securing your network, is going to increase astronomically as well, unless you take a fundamentally different approach. So the whole end-to-end strategy has to change, and we believe it has to change from this notion of perimeter security to this notion of zero trust networks. You can kind of think of the analog as if you live in a house versus you live in an apartment building. And the paper talks about this analogy as well. When you live in a house, there's only a few potential entry points to the house. So you lock the front door, you lock the back door, and you think you're pretty secure. If you think of yourself as living in apartment buildings, there are literally tens, maybe hundreds of different doors. And there's the notion of being able to close off the entire apartment building through that front door is gone. And so what you have to think about is each of the individual assets, the individual apartments, you have to secure each one of those individually. That analogy is really the analogy of what zero trust does. So what we're recommending is that we augment perimeter security with zero trust networking concepts. And simply spoken, there are really three fundamental principles involved here. The first is that you have to verify the user. Somebody trying to access network capabilities or system capabilities, you have to know for sure that that person is who they say they are. This most often involves multi-factor authentication. It's not enough for somebody to have name and password. You also have to have another factor, whether it be a CAC card, which the DoD uses, and can be another thing that you have, but ultimately going towards biometrics, that I can actually validate that the person accessing the resources is the person that I think it is. You have to verify the device. You have to say that when I give access to this device and this person, it's not going to add risk to my organization by having a virus on it, for instance. So you must have positive confirmation that the device is secure and not tampered with. And then you go to verify the particular access principle, the access privileges that the person has. So you say, not just can you access the network, but can you access this particular asset that's within the network? The idea then is that if you fail any one of these checks, you do not get access to the network, you do not get access to the assets that you want. The other thing that's critical to zero trust networking is the notion of encryption. If you think the network can be breached at any time, then you believe that there are bad actors within the network, and you have to encrypt all the data because they can be sniffing packets, they can actually be getting data off the network just without actually being able to access the particular systems. So the whole notion of encryption is fundamental to the concept. Think about what the impact of this might be. Take the Edward Snowden example. From the reports that happened, the idea was that Edward Snowden had system administrator privileges on many systems within the DoD. That means basically in the old notion of once you breach the perimeter, you have access to pretty much anything. Now think about that in that same situation in a zero trust world. That person, Edward Snowden, would have no access to any systems by virtue of their their role, and they would be given access based on the particular things that they needed to access in the organization. When they left, all that access would be taken away. So the whole risk to all data and the egress of all that data would be removed by the notion of zero trust networks, or at least made much, much better. The next thing I would say is we believe that there's an evolutionary approach to going towards zero trust. You don't have to actually do it all at once. You can basically pilot additional areas where you can start doing zero trust. You can put assets behind those boundaries. You can use things like microsegmentation to take a part of your network and separate it off for the rest of your network and put assets in that area. As I said before, the CAC card can be a fundamental aspect of the movement towards zero trust networking. The whole idea of what I have as well as who I am and my credentials, that multi-factor authentication, we believe the CAC card can be a real fundamental aspect to that. So again, simple concept, clear ways to implement that, evolutionary path towards actually implementing it in full in the DoD. And then finally, in terms of next steps, our goals is to follow up with folks in the Pentagon to make sure that we have an understanding of the current situation and the understanding of what we're proposing is clear. We want to answer questions that people have. We want to move forward and support the implementation in the ways that make sense for the DoD and for the DIB in particular, essentially be an asset where we can. And also continue scoping out the classified version to really take perspective of where we are today, the issues we have, and where we go from here. So with that, I would pass it back and we can have some discussion on the topic.
So I think we should, and the goal here would be to actually approve this report. Absolutely. Okay. So let me start by saying, first, I think it's fantastic, and I'll definitely vote for it. There's a little bit of context, which I wanted to sort of show you, that I worked, 30 years ago, I worked across the street at Sun, and there were 7 fallacies of distributed computing. Let me just read them from the original memo. The network is reliable, the latency is 0, the bandwidth is infinite, the network is secure, the topology doesn't change, there's only one administrator, transport cost is 0, and the network is homogeneous. Right, so this is 30 years ago. We're facing the same issues. Now, of course, the networks are infinitely larger. What I found, and you say this in your first question, is you start, if you want to sort of ask the right riddle, is tell me if all of the data on your network is encrypted at rest and in transport. And inevitably, the partner customer cannot answer that question. And you don't have a zero trust network until you can answer that question. So I would recommend that the hammer, the way this is written is sort of thoughtful, but the hammer is, how do you know that interlopers that are in your network are not stealing the data? Because it's all sitting there unencrypted. And that's my feedback.
I think that's a really good point. And again, fundamentally, encryption of all data, whether it be in transit and at rest, is a fundamental aspect. And plays with this notion that, again, you have to assume that your perimeter has been breached. That's what we do at Microsoft. I'm sure that's what you do at Google as well. Milo?
Yeah, I would just say, building on that, when I think one point of clarity, when you say data is encrypted at rest, it's not just encrypted at the disk level, right? Because system administrators have access to that encryption at the disk level. The issue is you want to encrypt the information at the information level so that a system administrator can't get at it. He doesn't have the cryptographic credentials just because he's running the system to actually decrypt the actual application data on that machine. And so that requires a different level of thoughtfulness about information architecture, right? Because you want to be able to segment information, use crypto not just to authenticate access, but to separate it so that only people with the appropriate roles can get at the information that's required. One thing I totally support the paper. I think one of the interesting points is the move to zero trust also means it's not the function of a perimeter is not, you're not depending on it for security, but you can use it to get information about what's going on. So if you think about an ML model where you're looking for what is the normal pattern of life in a network, certainly what we do at Google, people's access is profiled. And when you access information in an unusual way, that can trigger additional inspection. And so the point of the firewall now is not really about protection, provide some, but it's really about intelligence, so that you can actually model what the pattern of life is that's normal and detect what's unusual. And I think that's an important thing that we need to think about perimeter security and networking as an intelligence collection vehicle in our enterprise systems.
I think that's a good point. I think the other thing that we talked about in our discussion is when you talk about validating who that person is, an attribute of who that person is can be where are they coming from. Right. And if they're coming from a bizarre place that is not expected, then you basically fail that test that you know who that person is.
I also support the paper, but we run very similar parallels when we are dealing with SCI within the DoD. Everything is compartmentalized in that way. It's essentially a parallel version of this that's been active and moving on. Have you looked at how we might be able to take the lessons learned, positive and negatives, from that piece of what we do and apply it here? Because it seems to be the same thing. Essentially, we're compartmentalizing down to a need to know on all data. The second part of the question is, as we talked about earlier, there's a lot of siloing going on already to a great extent within our systems. This effectively will take that to the next level. How do we compartmentalize and still at the same time break down the barriers that we need to break down, as we talked about earlier?
I think it's a good point. I don't think we've necessarily captured all the learnings we probably should there. I do think we think about, you can segment things at the network level through microsegmentation. You can also segment it by role. Actually, one of the more challenging things I think are defining the roles of who is who in the DoD, and then having a system that says, not just, if I'm hired on in this role, I have these access privileges. When I change roles, in theory, immediately your access should change. And so I think there's a lot of learning still to be had there.
Kurt, I think it's really good, and I think the way the case is made that we're not substituting zero trust for perimeter access, we're adding zero trust in. Can you, and you talked a little bit about it, but maybe can you elaborate just a little bit on the sort of situation that we can begin to layer this in without having to wake up tomorrow and invest a huge amount of money to completely switch our security profile?
Yeah, there's some interesting pilots that are going on where using microsegmentation to say, hey, there's a portion of the network that routers are actually able to control access to based on who you are, and then taking some of the key assets that exist that may be the highest security assets and putting them in essentially a network of networks. That's it, and we're thinking through this at Microsoft as well. And you can do it two ways. One, you can say your most trusted assets you put behind such a micro-segmented architecture.
Or a proxy.
Right, exactly. The second thing you can do is you can take some of your most vulnerable assets, and I think about things like printers with network operating systems on them now, and you can put them in less accessible places as well. There have been some of the attacks going on involve printers and other IoT devices, and you have lots of different operating systems, not all of them patched appropriately, so moving them off is another approach as well.
I would just say I'm compelled, having worked on the swap study for a year, to say this fits absolutely in the category of start, do something, make progress, see if it works, fix it, do better. So I think it's terrific.
Yeah, I fully support this, and it seems like a complete no-brainer. This is where we need to be. In fact, it's where we should have been long before. One point on the intelligence dimension of this authentication. I'm just reminded, I buy a crazy amount of stuff on the internet with my credit card, and one time the credit card got flagged because of a $12 purchase at a Pep Boys auto parts shop. And I live in New York City. We just don't buy auto parts there. So this got flagged. This small amount of money got flagged.
Pattern of life.
A pattern, thank you. It's just a pattern of life. That's an extreme example, of course, of just pattern of usage of what is expected for your profile and your relationship to the organization. I was just wondering, could you just talk me through that third layer of access to these fences that are set up? Is that just another name and password? What is that third? First, you identify me, I'm that person. My device is then authenticated. That next step, is that just another password? What goes on there?
No, it's not another password. That's the area around what your access privilege is. And the fundamental concept is least privileged access, which says that you, by virtue of getting into the network, have no access to anything. And so the process exists because we know who you are now. The system of authentication says the service that you're asking for access to will talk to the authority that knows who you are and will say, yes, this person gets access by virtue of us knowing your identity. Now, it involves digital certificates. It's not, there is an actual validation process that you are who you are once you've been validated. But it's about...
It's already been done at that point.
Right, but now on an individual process by process asset you're trying to access, you have to have privileged access to that. So there's a validation that says, can Kurt have access, or can Neil have access to this particular asset?
But
Does
that's
that make sense?
automatic access once you already know it's me.
No, I think,
That's not really a third.
no, I think the issue is if you have a system that, say, doesn't use standard web protocols, which have all the credentials and role and identity on them, and I now want to access information on that system, right? Can I put a proxy in front that basically proxies my identity and my role and then grants me access to that resource? So part of the thing that's essential about how to do transition, we did this at Google using this approach, is you've got systems that were not designed with these kind of role-based, web-based protocols, right? How do you can't replace all these things, right? So you put them into, I don't want to say a ghetto, but you put them into a microsegment with a proxy in front. The proxy validates whether or not you are supposed to have access to that particular information resource, and then allows that access to that resource that hasn't been built with zero trust principles in mind. So
Okay,
you
but
put
it's
a
really
bunch
not then a third wall. It's, I've been verified, my device has been verified, now I have access to everything I'm supposed to have access to.
No, the proxy, the issue is the proxy is now the one who's applying judgment about what data you're allowed to have access to, not the actual resource with the information on it. Because that resource isn't part of the system, right? You have to have a transition path where you start with, I've got a bunch of stuff that's old and it uses the sort of non-web-based models, et cetera. Right? How do you make that transition?
So it would mean then that the person who either allocates that access or the system administrator version, the person who's that version in that world, would have the most, there's someone who has more access than you, presumably.
They set the rules.
They set the rules. And so that would make those people targets as never before.
Yes. No,
Sure.
not as never before.
Yeah, system administrators still exist. Those people have power. The other aspect of modern security is to reduce system administrators to their minimum and to also do escalated privileges so that people only get access to do things like grant Neil access for a moment, and then they're taken away again. So there are no standing privileges even to give access to other people.
So years ago at Google, when we would buy a little company, they would come with a whole bunch of IT infrastructure, and we would inevitably take that IT infrastructure and put it in a data center and put it in a ring-fenced network, which had a proxy that only allowed certain access, which we internally called jail. And then there was a big program to get them out of jail, right, to sort of move them into this architecture. So if you follow that analogy, then the vast majority of the DoD systems are going to have to be in their own little jails with their own little proxies, where you're going to have systems administrators, which is exactly Neil's point, who are going to be making these decisions about cross-access. And this is like a total mess, because as Milo said, you can't make the transition just in one day. So what we don't talk about in our report is what does a transition plan look like? Have you thought about that? Is that additional work that you think we should try to help them with?
There are definitely models from companies like Google and Microsoft as to how to pilot and expand. I think we are just in the early stages of saying what that would look like. I think the classified section provides us an opportunity to look at the pilots that exist. We have spoken already to folks that are doing piloting the concepts, but I think we still have to work through how richly would we go into the particular recommendations on the networks involved specifically.
Yeah, and I think it also relates to DoD's general movement towards cloud and information and changes in the back ends. So you have to make a decision. Do you proxy something, right, and leave that in place for a period of time? Or do you euthanize it, right, and move its information into a modern compute environment that comes with all of this to begin with, right? And so I think those are the challenges that DoD has, and there's not going to be one way to do it. There's going to be different systems, and you know, I think, as Kurt said, you know, the classified world has some of this, but let's not forget Snowden breached classified systems, right? Because things weren't as compartmented as they should have been, and you had a whole set of factors that played into his ability to do that that are going to have to be addressed, even in a classified world.
So let's get are there any final comments from the board?
Yeah, I have one.
Go ahead.
So if this is successful and it catches on, then that takes away an entire plot point of movies where someone, you know, they gather around the computer and they get the password and now they have access to all the launch codes and the missiles and things. So they'll have to be a little more creative now in storytelling.
Yeah, the next one will come up with some sort of an AI that manages to breach the unbreachable defenses that Milo has put in place, and that'll be the next narrative.
Yeah, all right, we're there.
Don't worry, the movies will continue.
I have a quick clarifying question for Kurt. So I think for me reading the paper, and I think others that are sort of newer to this technology might infer that when we talk about zero trust access control, we're talking about mostly human beings interacting with devices, exchanging information with each other over, you know, those kinds of systems. But I actually think that the paper is really also about everything that Michael raised, about talking about all the different machine-to-machine nodes that have to communicate with each other, and what are the handshakes that have to happen to know whether a machine can trust signal information it's getting from a sensor. Can you talk about those two different dimensions of it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it definitely, and we could probably make it more clear in the paper that it should be about both of those concepts. The first thing I would say is a lot of the machine-to-machine access, there's a lot of it that exists today, and a lot of that is done without the notion of multi-factor authentication. Essentially, when you steal a person's name and password, if you can find the interfaces and systems that are name and password only protected, then you can get into those systems directly as a result. So when you breach somebody's password, it's not just about breaching it as an individual. You can breach it and then impersonate a machine talking to another machine and accessing all the data as a result. There is the notion of what is a digital identity for a system or a machine, so that you know that this particular machine talking to another machine is in fact the one that it says that it is. And so the concepts are actually identically parallel. It's just you have to impute what the notion of the identity of a different system is, and then everything kind of flows from there.
Speaking for myself, I think you guys did a fantastic job, and the penalty for doing a fantastic job is now you have to actually work on this. But before we do that, we need to have a formal vote or non-vote. So can we go ahead? Are we ready to vote? Do we have a show of yeses to approve the report? I'll raise my hand. Okay. Yes. Josh, can you count?
Yes,
Okay.
I do. And then also, we can turn to our board members on the phone, if they could also chime in with their votes as well. Of course, you ask for any nay votes or abstentions. I think this is carrying unanimously, Eric.
Okay.
Good.
Shall we not? We don't have to vote for the noes then if everyone voted yes?
I think we have the majority that we need to get this through.
Excellent. So, but in return, I really do want you now to then take the next step of understanding what does the implementation look like, because I think the implementation for the DoD is going to be much more difficult than corporations, and every company I know of has struggled mightily with these issues. Yes, go ahead, Jen.
And just as well. Of course, you asked for
yes, for Misty.
Extensions, I think.
Those were two additional yeses?
His voice was encrypted.
Yeah,
I think that's the poverty of network bandwidth at work.
Indeed. Yeah, so tying it all together, I agree. And also just to note, since we started out talking about greater technology competence and capacity in the department, this is going to require that. This is work. This is, we've said before, software is something you do, not just something you buy. This is something that needs to be done, and it's going to take a lot of great, smart people. So pulling it all together.
Let's see. So Josh, are we going to have Michael give us an update?
Yep, absolutely. That's our
Michael.
Yeah, that's our last S&T presentation.
Thank you very much. And it's good to be here where we initially launched the conversation around AI ethics. In typical DIB fashion, what you're going to get is a little bit of work in process and engage, so you understand the openness with which we've approached this conversation around the AI ethics principles. I'll give you an update on where we are and just a little bit of the internal thinking that's going to lead to what we hope are our set of proposed principles coming up here later in the fall. Our task, as you remember, starts with the assumption that and if you needed any more zealots than you see across the table up here, with the assumption that AI and associated other versions of what you might call AI, whether it's AI machine learning, AI, et cetera, are already impacting and will impact essentially every element of the Department of Defense and the mission that it delivers. And that's not just the pointy end of the spear and the person who are delivering effects in a battlefield environment. That is across the enterprise. So in the backroom operations, in the way we care and feed and clothe and maintain capability across the enterprise. So with that as a starting assumption, the Secretary asked us to help work a process to provide input to the department as it determines how AI needs to fit into the principles under which the department already operates. I don't need to speak to those of you here in the department, but this is the sort of overall subject area of how we conducted the mission of a military, not just in the United States, but around the world, is a subject that has been debated, has been discussed, and has led to a set of core principles in the way the military delivers its mission. Those principles are founded in who we are as a people. They are founded in the documents that describe us, like the Constitution. They are founded in the international norms under which we operate. Those all define the rules of engagement, the rules of law in a military engagement, and the way we treat civilians and the way we treat people who are not civilians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we are not starting this conversation on completely virgin territory. The question that the department has asked itself, and by then reference to us in helping, is what does AI mean in that context? On one extreme, an answer could be, there's nothing new here under the sun. Everything that AI presents as a set of technologies, capabilities, and decision processes could simply be already covered by the way we bound our engagements and we bound the ethical principles under which we pursue our missions. Conversely, we could reach a point where we, the department, could reach a point where we say, there are really things here that are new, and they present new and novel issues to us with this technology, with the deployment more broadly of this technology. So the department asked the Defense Innovation Board to spend a year helping to engage the community and arrive at a set of thoughts and processes and proposed principles around artificial intelligence and engagement in the military. Help us, the department, understand what is in fact new or not. Help us understand if our current principles need or should or can be augmented, and ultimately lead to the articulation of a framework for the deployment of AI in various situations across the department. We have been doing that for the better part of a year now. It has engaged essentially all members of the Defense Innovation Board at one point or another. We started with and are in the middle continuing of a series of information gathering sessions. Many of you were part of the session out here. We had a session in Cambridge last January. We had a session in Pittsburgh in March, I think, and we had a session in Stanford in April. Those sessions involved generally public attendance and public comment, and for those of you who are part of it, some fascinating comments by people who are just concerned citizens, one way or the other, about artificial intelligence and the implications. Those sessions also involved invited experts from a very broad spectrum, people who came as ethicists, people who came as people who would use the technology in the field, people who use AI in various walks of life, et cetera. Those are really fascinating conversations that helped us to begin to coalesce onto a set of sort of guiding principles that we might want to put in place for the department. We also, as we begin to draft our thoughts, I wouldn't even say that we've reached the point of being able to articulate principles yet, but as we begin to draft our thoughts, we spent a session a couple of weeks ago in the Pentagon with what started out as a red team conversation, but essentially was an audience of people who would be in the field ultimately at the command level, having to live with a set of principles around AI and ethics. And a fascinating conversation amongst really, really smart and concerned and deep thinking people as to how this technology, first of all, forget principles for a moment. It's a bad thing to say, never forget principles, but how this technology impacts the decisions that are available to be made, that have to be made, and ultimately how commanders in the field think about making decisions in times of conflict or in times of preparation for conflict, et cetera. So an absolutely fascinating session. We will continue that over the next several months. And ultimately, our target is to be sitting at our October public meeting, having the same kind of discussion we just had on the Zero Trust Network. So a presentation on where we arrived at in the deliberation and debate. That will include a set of possible principles. Remember that the DIB does not own the principles. The Department of Defense will own the principles, but the DIB will deliver a report with a set of possible principles for the department. We also will likely have recommendations that would go around those principles. So recommendations on what the department might want to do in the rollout, in the necessary ongoing research or investigation around those principles. So our target is to get to October and be in that position. So that's the sort of preliminaries. Let me sort of go through just sort of some of the thought process we have underway. So some key themes as we talk about AI and ethics. First of all is a question of transparency, a question of being able to trace a principle and a decision that ultimately gets made in an open, transparent fashion. A little bit of elaboration to what I said before, that our hope is to be able to base any new principles to the maximum extent possible on that whole body of work that describes the principles under which we already operate. And so, again, asking the crucial question, what does AI present that's new, and therefore how do those principles layer on top of very well-established guidelines, principles, ethical frameworks that we have had in place. We have had, as you can imagine, lively debates on defining scope. So are we saying principles for AI? Are we saying principles for AI in the Department of Defense? Are we saying principles for autonomy? Are we stumbling into discussions about principles of ethics on technology? And so we are trying to continue to frame this in a conversation around artificial intelligence and the definition of artificial intelligence and what principles should be as narrowly defined to make sure that we are addressing the specific challenge around AI. We talk about recognizing the asymmetry that exists culturally. We ask our machines to be better than our people. And that's not a trivial statement. We have warfare, operations, engagements that are conducted by fallible humans, and we have a way of thinking about the fallibility of humans. We have a way of thinking about fallibility of humans that assumes that people will make a certain level of mistake. We train, we equip, we engage, we learn from actions, etc. And yet, as all of you know, particularly people here working on autonomous systems here in the Valley, we place a much, much higher level of obligation on our machines. And how do we think about that in the way we will make principles related to artificial intelligence? One big area that we talk about is what makes AI different. So is artificial intelligence today different than any other IT technology that we have talked about in the past? So we've been using various forms of computational technology for a long time. And where does AI cross a boundary that requires us to think about things different? So I'm going to go through a list of topics. Please don't interpret these as we decided this is a true statement. These are the kind of things that we're talking about as we go through the process. So one is the role that AI plays specifically in augmenting human judgment. So it's not just presenting more data, it's not just presenting more information to a human, it's augmenting the decisions and judgment that the human makes. So that's one thing we think about as a potential difference. We talk about the safety challenges, and a lot of this relates to how we determine whether our AI systems are doing what they think they're supposed to do, what we think they're supposed to do. So we have long experience, some good, some not necessarily good, on the way we do validation and verification on computational systems. The question, how we do testing and evaluation, ODT&E, T&E in general, and how does AI present new landscapes there? In particular, for machine learning systems where we learn over time, what is the challenge of being able to continuously determine the provenance, the efficacy, the validation, the verification, and go back to Kurt's presentation, the trustability of an AI system. So there's likely something that AI presents that is different than just an extension of classic IT. The speed, the scale, and the breadth of the application, I think, are unique. So all of you who have lived through decades of providing computational technology, network technology to the community at large and to the Department of Defense, you all operate on a very fast time frame, but if you think about AI right now, it is overwhelming the department in the ubiquity of people thinking about it, thinking about its applications. This is not just, let's think about all the places computers can be. This is about fundamentally transforming the way the department will operate. And that speed of change, the breadth of deployment, is really representing a watershed moment for the department. And yet at the same time, there is significant uncertainty about how that pace will continue. Will it accelerate? Will we reach another winter of AI? Where does this present to us an idea of how fast the technology is rapidly changing? And do a set of principles developed in 2019 apply in 2020? So trying to get to fundamentals that we can live with for a coherent fashion. There is obviously the role of the private sector. So while we talk about the ethical principles that the DoD needs to be involved in, we will, A, rely on the private sector in many cases for the development and deployment of technology, and we will operate in an environment where the private sector will be operating under its own set of ethical principles, or lack thereof, as it pursues the deployment of AI. And so, again, these are complicating inputs into the deliberation we're happening. A big issue we talk about is escalation risk, particularly for learning systems. Everybody's favorite term is a flash war, where mutually cooperating and competing AI systems begin to evolve in directions that are hard to estimate ahead of time. So we worry about that. We think about whether that presents a new circumstance for us under which we need to develop policy and principles. Issues around attribution in evolving systems. Issues around both algorithmic bias and data bias, both intentional and unintentional, have to be recognized in the way we will think about and develop ethical principles. And finally, an issue around what we are calling human agency and human data. So there's another one of these asymmetries where the systems have much more knowledge of the people who are acting in the system than the people acting in the system have knowledge of the computing systems. What does that mean from a human agency and the ownership ultimately of decision making that happens? So those are the kind of things that we are using as frameworks. The question is, so let me give sort of examples around some of the meta principles that we are using as we begin to focus the work down to a set of principles. So first of all, we're taking an ethics-first approach to the discussion. So an ethics-first approach around shared understanding, around development of norms in the community, ethical leadership writ large in the community, issues around foresight and projectability on where we think the technology will go, so that we're developing something. I would not be so bold as to use the word timeless, but we're not developing a set of ethical principles that are out of date in a year from now. And of course, a thoughtful, engaged community development process. So that's the work that's been underway. The principles themselves, I'm not going to talk about because they are still under debate, under discussion, under deliberation. And a series of recommendations that will coincide with that. Recommendations around how we would both enable the overall department to roll out a set of principles, to incorporate them into its doctrines and what it uses already. And so that's where we are. We're going to continue that process over the next several months, as I said. We'll have a couple of more integrated sessions, in particular with people directly impacted by any principles that would be articulated, to think about the implications of those in the way we prosecute engagements. And again, I will go back to what I said in the beginning. It's very important that we all think about this not just as what happens in an engagement. It's easy, necessary to think about decision-making in a conflict. It is just as important when we talk about AI to think about the implications for human power, human capacity, workforce development, and all of those implications in the backroom operation. And quite honestly, over a long time period, those may be more important than what happens in a decision in a conflict right now. So with that, I'm going to stop and open it up to my colleagues to provide input.
So clarifying question. So your timeline is the end of this calendar year, roughly?
Roughly.
In other words, maybe. And what does it ultimately look like? It looks like a proposal from us, our thoughts for them, that is the DoD, to consider.
Right.
Its recommendations or ideas. How fully thought will it be?
Right. Our hope, our expectation is that what we deliver would be, first of all, we'll answer the question, do we think you need new principles around AI? And if the answer is yes, here are the N things that you should consider incorporating into your ethical doctrine and ethical principles. Call those recommendations. And then a second set of recommendations that say, if you choose to proceed on those or not, here are some other recommendations on things that you should be doing around artificial intelligence. So you should be investing in provability, or investing in trustworthiness, or investing in ethical frameworks, et cetera. So, and our goal is to be able to have that debate with this group in October, and then essentially roll that out by the end of the year.
Timeline. And you've already heard this feedback from me earlier, but many corporations have now been through this process, and it's very important that anything we do reference the good work my bias, the good work of all the companies
Right.
who have really thought this through in from a commercial context.
Yeah, and I would just repeat what I said before. So I think both recognizing and benefiting from it, but also given the intertwining of what's happening in the commercial sector and the department, it's not clear that those things can be fundamentally separated from one another. So, other comments?
Sure. I think it's really important to point out that autonomy and AI are somewhat related, but they are different. We have plenty of non-AI based autonomous systems that deliver lethal force, from air-to-air missiles, GPS bombs, landmines, all sorts of systems. And so when we think about AI and autonomy, it's not something new. And there are plenty of existing ethics and standards that the department has that govern the use of these autonomous systems. So I think it adds a new dimension, but it's really about how do we give decision makers better data to make better decisions with. And so anyway.
I think you're absolutely right. And again, when I sort of talked about what we think is different, there's also conversation of what's the same. You know, an autonomous system is a system at which at some point somebody made a decision to deploy. Is it enough to think about, you know, is a 1 second delay relevant? Is a 10-second delay or a 10-minute or a 10-hour delay relevant? We think about that. And then the other question obviously is when I deploy an autonomous system, is it getting smarter over time? Is it changing over time? And how does that change the principles?
So just building on that, I think it's important to consider AI and autonomy at rest and AI and autonomy in motion and how these support people. It's also important to think about what capabilities we can get from AI systems. So in addition to the principles, what is it used for? What capabilities do we have? What works and what are the pitfalls? Because the technology is by no means solved. And so there are many challenges, but then there are also many excellent application areas. And so thinking about things like trustworthiness, robustness, uncertainty, error implications is very important.
Yeah, I just had two points to make. At no time did you address in this very thorough list the fact that some percentage of the public is actually terrified of AI. And is there some need to address the value of AI relative to the downside of AI? Because the public ultimately votes for members of Congress who allocate funds for the DoD. And so somewhere in there, there's got to be, you know, the recent advertising campaign of IBM notwithstanding, where everybody's smiling about AI, there's some deep thinkers out there who feel very differently about it. And so for this to be, here are AI principles just to guide us, but without any explicit reference to either the unfounded nature of the fear or ways in which that fear can and should be avoided by these principles.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I think it's a very important point. I would say two things. I think you and Daniela, in some sense, got to the same place, partially, which is we also have to say why we think this is an important aspect for the military. There has to be some value to it that has to be in the calculation. Certainly, our public sessions have engaged a fairly broad set of the community who thinks this is not something we should be doing. So that's part of the entire purpose of the public sessions. And I will tell you that not just the public, here's the microphone, tell us what you think portion of those dialogues, but the invited participants try to get as broad a spectrum as possible in that conversation. So that's been an active element of the discussions. So.
One other point, is this fundamentally different from how the DoD has approached other innovations in warfare? I mean, was there principles of nuclear weapon use? Was there principles of carpet bombing or chemical warfare? I mean, does this have precedent guide so that we can say in this long tradition of how we will conduct warfare going forward, AI is a not yet fully tapped resource. Here's how we need to think about it.
So the answer is yes, and Milo's going to answer too. I will only give you one part of that conversation. It's a very active conversation in the late 40s and 50s. And in the way that I got to the question of, does AI present anything new under the sun, or does it fall into all the things we do already? There was a fundamental conversation when it became clear that a nuclear weapon was not just a bigger bang, but we crossed a boundary into something that could be an existential threat, right? And I think, so the department does have a history, society does have a history of thinking through and confronting those issues.
Yeah, I think one of the important ways to sort of answer your question is, if you look at history, the U.S. and the Department of Defense has led the way in increasing levels of precision, with increasing levels of discrimination. So we believe ethically that more precise use of force with less collateral damage is an important ethic, right? That we don't want non-combatants and innocent people being harmed. And so there has been historically an increase in the level of precision and the narrowing of effects. This is moving from carpet bombing, mass dumb bombs, to fewer bombs with increasing accuracy, even in our nuclear weapons, right, increased CEP. So I think, decreasing CEP. So I think the question is really about, can AI improve the ability to discriminate? And if you can do that, is there an ethical imperative to actually do that? That if you can actually reduce collateral damage, reduce civilian casualties, does the department actually have an ethical obligation to use these technologies to do that? And I think that's an interesting angle. I'm not sure that has been incorporated into the debate.
Centerpiece of this report.
I mean, I think you asked the right question, which is what are the things that are really different or transformative here? One of the things that's come out so far in the conversations has been that the tempo of things can actually go faster than human decision making. And to me, that's actually a new problem, right? That all of the presumptions of human in the loop, but the decision process, which is called the OODA loop in the military, another crazy acronym, that the time is now very short. And that came up in quite a bit of the testimony. So what I would suggest, Michael, is that you try to articulate what are the things that are in fact different in a fundamental way, right? And I think it's going to be more than just up-tempo, which is the one I mentioned.
Up-tempo, not just in the kinetic realm, but in the cyber realm especially, right?
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things that, if you think about AI, the one observation is that AI learns quickly in the digital world, and it will iterate much faster in a fully digital world than it will in a combined digital and hardware world, because the digital world can learn, change, optimize very, very, very quickly, whereas when you start adding hardware, even if it's very, very smart hardware, the hardware evolution chain is slower. So one of the things to talk about is, if it's true that the evolution of AI occurs the way I described, then the consequence is that the emerging threats will occur first in cyber, right? And if that's true, then that has a lot of ethical implications for how we want to handle that, right? And there are many, many, many questions brought out by this statement. More comments? Are we good? So Michael, so the answer is you're doing more work.
Yes.
When this thing comes out, it's going to be a huge deal because a lot of people have a lot of opinions about this.
Yes. I know many people here have been involved in it. I do want to say a thanks here and publicly. We have had a lot of voices in this conversation. One would hope that that would be the case, and it's gratifying. And they have not all, Neil, to your point, this has not been a whole set of people saying, just tell me where the checklist is so I can use this stuff. There's a lot of people been involved in this discussion with real deep-seated fears about what happens when learning technology turns loose. So it's been an active conversation. So, thank you. Josh, back to you.
Great. Thank you very much.
I'll just add one. Sorry for my persistent storytelling references, but I'm reminded of, was it Ray Bradbury, who was the science fiction writer, who was asked by one of his fans, why do you keep writing about these dismal futures? Is this what you expect us all to walk into as time goes on? He said, no, I write about them so that you will know to avoid them. And I thought that was just a deep lesson from the world of storytelling.
So it's customary for the department to brief the board on what the department is doing with the advice that it receives. And so at these meetings, we always do a brisk run-through of a number of examples that are worth highlighting for the board members and also for the public, of people in the department who are doing exceptional things, often very challenging and courageous things, as we heard from Jen in the beginning. It's often difficult to try to get to these breakthroughs or these indicators of optimism. So let's run through a few examples. Before we do, I just want to offer a little bit of quick context. Federal advisory committees like the Defense Innovation Board provide advice, but they have no authority to implement. The information that's being provided are things that the department's doing that are related to, or in some cases, a direct result of the recommendations and reports that the board has done. And we always include these updates. And last, I just want everyone to know the next meeting of the board will be in Washington, D.C. on October 25th, as you heard Michael say, in terms of getting ready for what we hope will be the culmination of this year-long effort on the AI Principles Project, as well as other topics that you heard. Let me dive right in with a few of these selected highlights. So first and foremost, the last time the board got together was May, was for the software report, which Eric mentioned. Highly acclaimed, easy to read. Strongly recommend you have a look at it. That's our website where you can download not only the report, but some other pieces that went into it. The Agile BS detector, of course, probably being one of the more prevalent and more popular, but there's a lot of great resources and content and examples, including stories and case studies of individuals that contributed to the report. So that's a good place to go for that. And so let me tell you a little bit about what has happened in the department since you published the report. Just for everyone, there were 10 primary recommendations, 26 total, but 10 primary recommendations. Each one is fairly detailed with a number of different sub-elements, and they generally fall into these 4 categories. First is really about changing the statutes, the processes, and the procedures for software. I think very much to the point that Jen made, software is not only something you buy, it's something that you do. And that's very important. The second was a recognition that software requires a certain kind of environment and infrastructure and tooling and resources, cloud was mentioned a few times, that enable that software to be developed in a modern way. And so there was a number of recommendations in the report about what the department needs to do to enable either individuals or organizations or contractors outside the department to be able to deliver that software in a modern way. Often we call that DevSecOps. The third, and this just directly dovetails into what Jen was saying, the work that Jen and her committee has been doing, is to think about what the pathway is for that STEM talent, that digital talent, and the things the department needs to do to make that possible. And then the last are changes specifically to the acquisition processes. You think of all of the billions of dollars spent on the systems the department has had for decades or will buy today in the future, and we have to think about the changes the department needs to make and how it thinks about the software components of those systems. And it's really one of the key premises of the report is it's the software that is definitive in those systems and the advantage and the capability they provide. So getting the software-defined weapon system correct, it really becomes the most important part of the choices that get made in the acquisition system. So the update is for all of those areas that you wrote about, the department has now identified a senior leader to be the champion of each of those efforts, and each one has a working group and a a fairly detailed plan for how they plan to move out and implement those things. And just for people that may not be familiar, that is quite unusual for a federal advisory committee board to go. They essentially have an extremely thoughtful, thorough, detailed, resourced plan for implementation within a few weeks of publishing documents. So something really, I think everyone's really proud of the work that was done, as Eric was saying. So let me get a little bit more specific about each one. So within each of those areas, we have Ellen Lord, who's the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment, the sponsor of the study, really the champion for the effort, delivering her implementation plan for this, as well as other recent studies on the subject. The Defense Science Board also recently wrote a report on software. There's some other groups as well. And so her team, led by Jeff Bowling, who we work really closely with, who wanted to be here today to deliver this presentation himself, far better than I would be able to, but Jeff wasn't able to make it. And so they are working through this plan, which they'll be briefing to Congress, I think, in about 2 weeks. We'll obviously be able to share that plan with you once that plan's been briefed to Congress and is approved and is public. Stacy Cummings, who's a senior leader in Ellen's organization, in Ms. Lord's organization, is responsible for that first and fourth lines of effort. And there's really 3 things I want to highlight about the effort that Stacy is leading. The first is the notion in the report of creating a new acquisition pathway specifically for software is being implemented right now. That's something the department has the authority to do. Congress in the recent NDA is offering the department additional authorities and more clear authorities, but it's really something that the department has the ability to do this. And so in their rewriting of the acquisition code, they are creating a special path for software design to streamline how people make decisions about the software that they buy and make it easier for them to make the right choices and to make them rapidly, to be able to work with organizations like DIU and others to do this right. And then the next part I want to emphasize is that once you have an authority to make a decision, enter in that contract, you need an appropriation to be able to expend those resources. And so right now, there is a proposal to create new type of appropriation specifically for software, and the department is working really closely with Comptroller, OMB, and other Congress to try to figure out how you would implement a new way of thinking of how we pay for that software. And of course, there's an extensive discussion about the challenges of our current colors of money problem, as you described, where we have money that's fenced off for certain kinds of uses, and the categories they use for what those uses are doesn't really match the way software is developed in a modern way. And so the tension between the old way of denominating resources for projects and the new way of developing the software that enables those projects are fundamentally at odds. And so this is the department's effort to try to address both how we choose what we buy and then how we go about buying it. And then the last thing that Stacy's focusing on right away is a critical issue that came up in all of your discussions, which is IP and source code, which of course is part of the cybersecurity and zero trust conversation that you just had. And so the department's trying to really move forward on developing new law, regulation, and policy on how it treats IP to basically have a modern approach to having a balancing act between respecting the IP of the developers, but also being able to do the kind of inspection that it needs to do, the kind of integration it needs to do. So those are 3, I think, very significant projects that we're trying to get done quickly, and Ms. Cummings is leading that up. The next line of effort I wanted to mention is specifically enabling the environment that we talked about. And so Peter Ranks, who is the Deputy CIO for the Information Enterprise, one of the top leaders in the CIO organization for the whole department, is the lead for this. And what's exciting about Peter being in charge of this is that you should know a bit about his background. He was the person at the Central Intelligence Agency that moved the CIA into the cloud. So you can imagine there was some red tape involved with that transition. And so he's very experienced in figuring out organizationally, bureaucratically, and technically what has to happen to move a large organization that's very security conscious into an environment where they can be rapidly shipping code on classified systems. And so we're really thrilled that he's joined the department for a short time to lead us through here. And from him, the key thing they're looking for is ATO reciprocity. So we've had a number of leaders say that if there was one thing that they wanted to see changed, it is that every time you have a piece of software, whether it's any of the 4 flavors of software that you described, whether it's custom to the department or it's purely commercial, needs to get an ATO every single time it's used. Each independent system, each independent organization, each governed by a different set of rules. That slows things down a lot. So if the department could just agree to recognize the authority to operate that's given to a system once and allow it to be, if not fully universal, at least used more than once, that could cut an enormous amount of time and expense out of these processes. And so that is a big deal. And then last, building on what Jen was talking about, we have a whole line of effort and a cross-department-wide working group on trying to figure out how to address these talent management issues that Eric emphasized. And the goal here for this group is to deliver a software workforce strategy. And so they'll be working, I hope, sort of directly with you, Jen, to figure out how to connect all these things. Of course, there's many dimensions of the technical talent we need that are not software specific, but whether you're talking about the future battle network or you're talking about AI and ML, they're all software systems at some level. You have to have the software talent to do any of those things. So any questions about SWAP updates from our SWAP leaders? Great. Awesome. Congratulations. So next, let me talk a little bit about recommendation number 1 from the board. This is 2.5 years old now, the increased workforce innovation capacity. So great story. There were 4 junior officers, but pretty much as junior as you can be as an officer in the Navy, who had some strong views about how they felt the choices were being made in terms of who gets to do which jobs in the Navy, directly responsive to the points that Jen raised. And so they had enough coding talent on their own. They were able to write their own algorithm and got permission from the Navy to use it as a test. And in that test, it outperformed all the existing human and machine systems the Navy has built. So it's pretty exciting to show both what can happen when you give a little bit of permission and authority and room to run to a group of sailors that want to make a difference and have a little bit of coding talent, but then the implications, if it gets fully implemented, even at partial scale, could be a significant problem, a significant solution to the problem, at least in Navy, of trying to figure out how to get the right people with the right skills and the right jobs. At the same time, looking at the problem not in terms of the talent in uniform, but the talent in the civilian workforce, Defense Digital Service, with which the Defense Innovation Board, of course, works very closely, has developed a new program called CHAS, Civilian Hiring as a Service, to try to make it very, very easy to bring technical talent into the department. Many of you probably know that the average time from being recruited for a position in the federal government to being able to actually show up at work is 186 days. It's not something that anyone should be particularly proud of. And so the idea of both trying to figure out how to proactively look for the right talent, not to passively wait for an application on USA Jobs, and then to make that process of getting that person onboarded rapidly is a key enabler for trying to get the talent that we need. And DDS is working with a number of recruiting companies to try to solve that problem. Another sort of core premise of some of the words initial writing that gets, I think, marbled through all the things you've written in the SOF report in particular is the notion that computer science should be a core competency of the department. And you heard Jen and others mention Kessel Run a few times. Kessel Run's not the only place in the department where people in uniform and the civilians and contractors are able to apply DevSecOps and ship code, but it's certainly one that we feel very close to. We wanted to point out that there are some others that have equally colorful names drawn from science fiction and film. I know that will appeal to you, Neil. And one of them is called Kobayashi Maru, to make sure that there's not a Star Wars exclusive chokehold on catchy names. And the other is called Bespin. And so we see, particularly in the space enterprise and the training enterprise, some really promising things going on with rapid software development. And it's not on the slide, but I'll just mention it as well. Another example of this is JSOC, which also has created their own dev environment and is able to ship code to service members right away. And I think what we see that's really promising is something that Milo and Eric used to talk about, which is the virtues of competition. And so what we've seen is that Kessel Run, Kobayashi Maru, Bespin, JSOC, these organizations are now competing with each other to see who can ship code faster and get a application from a whiteboard, brainstorming with users into the field as early as possible. And so 78 days was the record, and then it was 62 days, and then one got 61 days, and I think I heard 58 days was the record, and then I got corrected a week later that now one was at 57 days. And so you see is they're competing with each other to drive down the amount of time it takes to ship applications, and if that's not what you want to see, I don't know what would be. I mean, that is exactly what we want. And then, again, just drilling home in this ATO issue, I think it was a year and a half ago, several board members were just north of here at Beale Air Force Base interviewing some airmen about what they were trying to do with trying to build some software systems for their ISR mission. And one of them said, I wrote down the quote because it was quite catchy, and when asked what he needed to stay in the Air Force and to want to continue to do the work, he said, I don't need a raise, I just need an ATO. Which is that he just wants to be able to field the systems that he's building and see people get to benefit from the work they're doing. And so the Air Force has really listened, and they've moved forward with this, and so they're working on what they're calling a fast-track authority to operate. Sometimes people call it ATO in a day. But they're really trying to shift the burden from a compliance checklist framework into how do we accredit the systems on which the software is built, and if we can trust the systems that was built on and we know the process was followed, the ATO should follow from that, and then there should be reciprocity for it. So this represents a real philosophical shift that the board presented on a number of occasions, and it is very promising, certainly something we hope other services will soon adopt. Eric, you'd mentioned the fundamental nature of AI and how much that has been an emphasis of the board. Two things I wanted to mention, because we have some representatives of the Joint AI Center in the audience, and of course work very closely with them. They are already fielding one of their first algorithms. In this case, it's for their Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief National Mission Initiative. They have several national mission initiatives to start. HADR is just one of them. And for this one, they already have developed some applications where they can take imagery from a natural disaster, whether it's here in California, where there have been many, or other places, and use that automated processing of algorithms to help first responders figure out how to understand and predict where a fire or a flood might be going and get to those people faster, respond faster, to try to save lives or save property. Obviously, a lot of applications of that kind of technology for processing and imaging faster, but it's pretty exciting to see that within even the first 6 months, the JAIC is able to bring some of those kinds of capabilities online. And then the Air Force also, in some ways following the example of the Army building its partnership with Carnegie Mellon, the Air Force has established a partnership for an AI accelerator at MIT. And so this is a great example of the kind of partnering between the leading thinkers and doers in the military working with academia to try to bring in those perspectives and strengthen the dynamism and the vibrancy and the diversity of thought and try to figure out how is the department going to embrace these new technologies in a way, as Michael was saying, that is ethical as well as it is advanced. Also, just another update on AI, we have had several meetings with the Army AI Task Force, which is part of the new Army Futures Command in Austin. And one of the things that we saw that really made an impression on us because of the work that Michael described is they've now named a chief ethics officer for the Army AI Task Force. They're the first service to have an ethics officer for AI. And they formed a sort of internal working group that draws on the academic institutions within the Army, such as its service academies and its legal community and the JAG Corps, to figure out how to bring the right perspectives, technical, legal, and operational together to help make these decisions. One of the areas where they're focusing on is the human resource recruiting and personnel functions that have also been part of this conversation. So we really see the Army moving out swiftly with the AI task force and doing so in the way that we would characterize as the ethics-first approach that Michael described, making sure that they've put those sorts of considerations front and center and bringing in the right people to think through those issues at the beginning and not in the middle or at the end. Acquisition, of course, plays a prominent role. You heard Mike Brown when he welcomed us here talking about all the things that DIU is doing to try to accelerate acquisition pathways. And one of the things we found is that it isn't always the right idea to turn to industry. Sometimes there are things we can do ourselves. So here was an example of a Special Operations Command requirement for a small UAV. They wanted to be able to do some internal mapping of internal spaces. This is a very dangerous job. They wanted to see whether a machine could do it instead of a person. And they got back from industry what seems to me by DoD standards to be a very low cost estimate and an aggressive timeline of almost $2 million and almost 1 year. But that wasn't fast enough for SOCOM, so they asked whether some of their own operators, whether they had the skills and abilities to try to build a prototype themselves, and they basically did a hackathon and for a few $1,000s and in 4 days managed to actually get there. And so we will hope to see more small units empowered to make those kinds of changes. I wanted to highlight another partner organization we often work with, NSIN, the National Security Innovation Network. Some of you may know them formerly of MD5. they've also formed a fellowship program to get more undergraduate and graduate students working on hard military problems. So the X-Force Fellowship, as it's called, is one where they'll now be able to get students working directly with military units on trying to work through their problems. And so if this is interesting to you or know someone who is, you can see us afterwards and we can put you in touch with our friends at Ensign. And then last, I wanted to mention this kind of network consolidation that needs to be done in order to simplify the complexity of the networking and internal communications problems that we're facing. And so a big push from the CIO office now is actually taking 14 entire agencies, each with their multiple IT systems, trying to get them to converge on single networks. And if we can't do these sorts of things well, we're certainly not going to be able to implement the zero trust idea that Kurt discussed or the issues that Michael Zatman raised. So we wanted to highlight the progress that CIO has been making in trying to bring these things together. And so now, let me pause to see whether there's any questions or comments from the board about any of those examples I ran through. Please.
I'd just like to thank you for those because I feel like I started out on a slightly darker note. It's been sad to see sort of the threat to some of the projects that we have been such champions of and so encouraged by, but all of those examples are incredibly encouraging and just reminds us each time I think we hear them that there's so much good going on in the Department of Defense. And thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Great. All right. Well, now we get to hear from all of you. So if you are interested in making a comment, hopefully not to exceed 2 minutes, you can just line up here in the front. We'll actually just do the comments here from the podium. Please do fill out a form because you can hand them to my colleague Travis here, so we just get your name and information and we follow up with you. If you don't have one of these, just wave your hand and a member of my team will bring one to you. Hopefully we'll have a chance for 5 or 6 people at least to share their views. And if not, I'll start randomly calling on the people I recognize. Thank you, sir.
Hi, my name is Captain Rick Arthur, U.S. Navy. I just wanted to make a comment to Jen Palka. One recommendation I would make as far as the manpower solution could very well come out of the reserves. I feel like that's a much easier and flexible organization because they're not dealing with the operational requirements on a day-to-day basis. One example of that is I'm a reservist myself. I'm a TV writer normally. Right now I've been brought back onto active duty to help manage an AI project at China Lake for NavAir. Last night I had dinner in San Francisco with another reserve officer who's managing an AI project that's at Google. So there's a very big and diverse group in the reserves that active duty and technology can call on. What I would do to on your side to encourage the reserves is to look at ways to make it easier to assess people in Silicon Valley into the reserves, similar to what's been going on in the civilian side. That's it. I wanted to say, Josh, 2 weeks ago I went to the Jake Fires and Maneuver AI conference. It was very good. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tim Hickey. I work for Oracle Corporation for the last 18 years, and I've been working with the Department of Defense for the last 4 years across DoD agencies and the Army personnel payroll groups. And one of the things that I've seen and been working with a lot in the DoD is the data redundancies and data duplications, and the fact that a number of the DoD agencies all seem to store the same bits of information. While they have their own needs for mission critical information and extended value information, those core records need to be, I think, defined into a trusted ledger that they can all share and have a single source of truth. So my comment to the board is that blockchain technology today actually, with your zero trust, gives us an extra capabilities around building trusted shared data nodes that the departments could use and eliminate a lot of the data movement that's really choking up the network, causing lots of human errors, and exposing data to unforeseen people. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Joey. I'm a captain in the Air Force. Been at AFWorks for about a couple of years now. And one of the things I wanted to highlight was regarding to the network to C3 piece. So we call it a different name as well. We call it multi-domain operations, just for another acronym in the mix. But we actually did over the last year was we ran our challenge process. So over the last couple of months, we had 300 companies apply. We down selected that to 60 companies who are going to present here at our Fusion event in Vegas in a couple of weeks. And out of that, we'll put companies on contract to prototype a C3 network for the Air Force and test that out with some of our joint partners in this year, because we recognize we want to get the best industry companies to engage with us to make that happen. And so just wanted to invite anybody to engage with us to keep building out the MDO space. And also for the workforce piece, we can get people to do amazing work because of the impact that they can have in the Air Force. The challenge is the admin systems. So I think we need to put more pressure on holding our generals and holding the people that own these systems accountable to delivering results in weeks, right? So it shouldn't take me 60 days or 158 days to get paid if I switch sides to active or reserve and go from there. So.
Thank you. Do we have other comments, John?
Last chance. Covered a lot of comments. We're talking about zero trust, cyber, battle networks. I know several people in the room have opinions about the workforce issues that Jen raised. AI ethics, lots to choose from. Going once, twice. Okay, Eric,
so
wrap it up.
I wanted to mention that I think we're having a reception later today with a group. It's called Vets in Tech. Is that correct? And we have some representatives in the room. I don't think I can overstate the importance of the links between the veterans and the service that they're providing in the tech industry. I suspect, Kurt, you have met with your equivalent in your corporation. In Google, there's a very active vet network, and these people are phenomenal, just phenomenal people. So I'd like to make sure that we offer them a great welcome, to remind people that these are in their corporations. They are tremendous assets to the corporations and also to the nation. And I think consistent with the earlier comments about the reservists, what AFWorks is doing, I think we sort of see the same thing. I also wanted to mention that we're here because we want to showcase the importance of DIU, DIUX. We have a strong leader who we've worked with for a pretty long time. We're going to spend the whole afternoon going through all the stuff you're doing. But the creation of this organization maybe 3 or 4 years ago made a mechanism for tech to talk in a more rational way with the way the DoD actually works. And so I cannot overstate the importance of what you're doing to modernize and bring to a sort of at least the year 2000 some of the systems inside of the military. If I look at the next 6 months, we've got a lot of stuff going on. I didn't emphasize, and I should have emphasized, this AI ethics work that Michael talked about. That's going to be a very big deal as it comes out. And I want to remind you that that I emphasized in my first comments 7 or so areas, and we started with the workforce stuff. And so I want to come back to workforce as being sort of a huge initiative. Josh, should we add anything else to the discussion?
No, I think that's perfect.
Okay. I have one more thing to add. I want to remind all of you that these people are volunteers. So I want to thank you all for your service to the country, to the board, and to our friends working on this. You don't have to do this. You do this out of the goodness of your heart. You have many other things you want to get done, and I think it's in the tradition of public service that we all operate. Thank you very much. Thank you all, and thank you, Josh. Thank you to the audience.
Can I just, for 1 second before you all leave, can I ask the staff that's here to stand up? Because I think Eric did a very nice job of recognizing all.
I always forget to, and I should.
Aaron and Skylar and
Skylar is over.
Come on, everybody, stand up.
Aaron is over there.
These are the people who do the work every day.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.